In March 2004, Roy Ramsey eased a 1978 Ford F-250 into the lot at Hastings Diesel and Implement, and conversations inside the glass showroom thinned to silence as if someone had closed a valve. Rust bled through both fenders in jagged patches. The odometer read 312,000 miles. Fence wire held the passenger mirror in place where a proper bracket had failed years earlier. Roy climbed out in patched coveralls, a faded cap and boots darkened by old oil and clay dust, carrying a folded notepad instead of a financing folder. He looked to nearly everyone watching, like a man who might ask for used filters on credit and then apologize for asking. Clint Morrow watched him approach from beside a polished 425 horsepower tractor priced at $389,000. Clint wore a pressed dealership shirt, clean denim, and a silver watch that flashed every time he pointed at a machine. He gave Roy a practiced smile and walked him through the numbers in a confident rhythm. 10% down, 8.75% interest, 20-year note, total paid $789,624. He said the annual payment would be $39,481 and treated that figure like an entry fee for serious operators. Roy listened, eyes on the tire lugs, then asked a single question about salvage yard leads for an older, high-horsepower platform. Clint laughed openly this time and told him salvage iron was for people who wanted to stay small. A few younger farmers near the parts counter smirked into their coffee cups. Roy nodded once, thanked him for the figures, and left without touching a brochure. The town took the scene at face value, because face value is what people trust first. Roy farmed 1,260 acres in Adams County and rented another 740, but he still lived in the same two-bedroom farmhouse his parents bought for $18,500 in 1969. The porch sagged slightly on the west side. The kitchen linoleum had been repaired with a square patch near the sink. His annual household spending sat at $19,340. Tracked to the dollar, food $6,480, utilities $4,260, fuel and transport $2,700, insurance and taxes $3,900, clothing $420, church and local giving $1,200, miscellaneous $380. He had no taste for display and no patience for monthly obligations that arrived whether rain did or not. His private rule stayed simple and absolute. If he could not pay cash, he did not buy. That rule had not come from a slogan. It came from arithmetic and memory layered over 30 years. In 1985, when Roy was 23, he watched his neighbor, Harold Jensen, lose 480 acres after variable rates reset above 16%. Harold had expanded during good corn years with 3 notes that looked manageable at signing and became crushing when prices slid and interest climbed. Roy stood at the fence while auctioneers tagged a combine, 2 tractors, and a pickup. Nobody mocked Harold. He had worked hard and trusted the wrong structure at the wrong time. Roy carried that image into every purchase after. His father, Glenn Ramsey, was less dramatic and more precise. Glenn kept a ledger by the kitchen radio and wrote every expense in pencil before bed. He would tell Roy, "Debt rents your future, to weather." When Glenn died in 1996, he left land that was paid for, 2 old tractors that still ran, $41,300 in cash reserves, and 1 instruction: keep options open by keeping obligations low. Roy and his mother, Irene, followed it line by line. Irene passed in 2001, and Roy took full operation control with no siblings contesting the estate, no outside investors, and no banknote secured by machinery. By the second week of April 2004, Roy still used the same method he had built through the late 1990s. Buy durable used equipment at distressed sales, rebuild only what pencil math justified, and redirect the avoided payment stream into land, grain storage, and operating liquidity. The sequence looked plain on paper and extraordinary over time. In 1997, he bought 160 acres at $1,150 per acre, total $184,000, cash from retained earnings, and a small CD ladder he had built over 6 winters. In 1999, he added a used grain bin setup for $42,600 and saved an average 18 cents per bushel by timing sales instead of hauling at harvest panic prices. In 2001, he purchased a 1977 articulated tractor for $23,400 and spent $11,800 restoring driveline and hydraulics, then ran it for a total cost that stayed below 1/3 of nearby financed alternatives. In 2003, he leased 220 additional acres at $142 per acre, paid on time, and never used operating debt to bridge rent. A year-by-year ledger in Roy's office documented the compounding effect better than any speech. 1998. Gross crop revenue, $412,700. Total debt service, $0. Retained cash, $74,900. 1999. Storage upgrade paid cash. Marketing gain, $31,200 versus elevator spot average. 2000. Machinery repairs, $18,440. Avoided replacement note estimated at $27,900 annual payment. 2001. Drought pressure. Yields down 14%. Farm remained cash positive by $22,600 because fixed obligations stayed low. 2002. Bought 80 acres from retiring neighbor at $1,420 per acre. Cash total, $113,600. 2003. Net operating margin, $186,300. Year-end liquidity, $337,400. The numbers were not flashy. They were resilient. What outsiders read as stinginess was often maintenance discipline disguised as routine. Roy changed fluids by hour interval, not by season guess. He bought filters in bulk when prices softened. He pulled and inspected bearings in winter before failure could force spring downtime. A newer machine on long financing could hide neglect for a while. An older machine demanded respect immediately. Roy preferred demands he could control. When an implement needed fabrication, he priced steel, labor, and expected service life against financed replacement costs and only proceeded when the payback horizon landed inside 3 seasons. That framework kept him from emotional purchases and from panic purchases, the 2 most expensive categories in farm equipment. His truck became a local joke and a local landmark at the same time. People noticed the wire mirror, the faded paint, the cracked bench seat repaired with canvas tape. They did not notice that the truck represented a decision to keep $600 to $900 monthly in his accounts for decades instead of in a lender's schedule. Over 20 years, even a modest, avoided payment of $700 per month became $100,000 to $68,000 before interest opportunity. Roy had run that calculation often enough that he no longer argued it out loud. 2 weeks after the dealership exchange, Roy stopped at a coffee shop on Highway 34, unfolded the latest regional equipment sheet, and circled a listing outside Grand Island. fire-damaged Big Bud 400 frame, seized engine, stripped cab, $900 cash, buyer hauls. He wrote one more figure beside it, $300 for transport, then another line under that. Rebuild ceiling, $70,000 all in or walk away. He did not smile. He did not announce anything. He finished his coffee, paid in cash, and drove out in the same rusted Ford toward a scrapyard most people in town would never consider a place to find a future. The yard outside Grand Island was half mud, half cinders, and all of it smelled like wet steel when Roy pulled in just after noon. His Ford rattled past stacked axles and bent grain trailers until he reached a chain-link gate marked Cash Sales Final. Two mechanics in clean logo jackets stood by a forklift and watched him park. One glanced at the truck, then at Roy's patched sleeve, and asked if he was looking for scrap weight pricing. Roy handed over the listing sheet, tapped the line that read Big Bud 400 frame, and asked where they had set it down. The foreman, Wade Tilson, walked him there with the polite distance people use when they expect a short conversation. The machine sat behind a row of burned irrigation motors, cab glass gone, paint blistered to gray scales, front tires cracked almost smooth. Wade said most callers wanted a photo, not a purchase, and that a collector from Colorado had offered to wire a deposit when his banker clears it. Roy crouched by the articulation joint, checked for heat warping, then measured the frame with a folding rule he carried in his coat. He pulled the dipstick from the seized engine, rubbed carbon between his fingers, and wrote 3 numbers on his pad. Salvage entry 1,200, including freight. Probable drivetrain 34,800. Contingency 14,000. He stood, looked at Wade, and asked for a bill of sale. Wade named the price again, $900 for the unit and $300 hauling. Roy counted 12 $100 bills from an envelope and set them on a dented tool chest. The mechanic who had asked about scrap pricing stopped smiling. Cash makes a different kind of silence. And before we go any further, if you want to see how a $1,200 decision can outrun a 20-year payment table, follow this all the way through the arithmetic, because this is where the method becomes visible. The haul truck arrived before sunset, and Roy followed it west at 50 miles per hour, hazard lights blinking on the F250 whenever traffic stacked behind him. He had made drives like that for years, not because he romanticized old iron, but because he trusted controlled risk over financed certainty. At 23, he had already seen what certainty looked like on paper when interest moved against working families. Harold Jensen's auction in 1985 had stayed with him, yet Roy's rule hardened through his own near miss in 1989 when a dealer in Kearney tried to close him on a new planter package at 9.4% with a balloon in year 7. The note would have carried an annual obligation of $21,760 on projected acres he did not yet control. Roy took the paperwork home, laid it beside Glenn Ramsey's pencil ledger, and ran a stress test at 3 yield scenarios and 2 corn price assumptions. Under normal weather, the package worked. Under 1 dry year and a 14-cent basis penalty, it pushed cash flow negative by $18,300 before household costs. He returned the next morning and declined. That decision redirected his path in ways nobody could see at the time. Through the 1990s, he treated every avoided payment as an asset purchase waiting for its hour. In 1990, he banked $17,200 that would have gone to equipment debt and used it in 1992 to buy 40 acres from a retiring cousin at $980 per acre. Total $39,200 with closing costs. In 1993, he repaired a used 6-row planter, for $2,460 in parts and $640 machine labor. Then ran it 6 seasons with annual maintenance under $420. In 1994, he stored grain instead of panic selling and captured an average spread of 22 cents per bushel across 118,000 bushels. Gross improvement $25,960. In 1995, he replaced a failing truck transmission for $1,380 rather than financing a replacement pickup at $468 monthly. Small moves, repeated. By 1998, his operating framework had 4 fixed rules written on the wall above his desk. Rule 1, cash first, then purchase. Rule 2, any equipment acquisition must beat the financed alternative by at least 35% over 5 seasons. Rule 3, maintenance before failure, because emergency repairs are the interest rate nobody calculates. Rule 4, land over shine, always. He did not recite these rules in coffee shops. He used them in private and let the books speak. The books did speak, especially when the county entered years that punished optimism. Between 1999 and 2003, fertilizer swings and basis volatility made planning harder for everyone in Adams County. Roy's neighbors worked as hard as he did, often harder, yet many carried stacked obligations built during better cycles. Nate Hollis expanded from 1,100 to 1,680 acres on machinery notes and a variable operating line that reset from 6.1% to 9.8% in under 2 years, lifting his annual financing burden by $31,400. Darren Kemp financed 2 late-model tractors and a combine package totaling $612,000 with blended debt service of $74,900 per year. Luis Ortega added 320 acres under a land contract with aggressive principal steps that assume stable yields and no major weather shock. None of them were reckless men. They were trying to keep up with what the market and lenders called modern scale. Roy chose a slower scale and a larger cushion. By the end of 2003, his year-end liquidity reached $337,400. His machinery debt remained zero, and his paid-for acreage plus stored grain gave him options when timing mattered. He wore patched coveralls while holding a balance sheet that could absorb a bad season without calling a loan officer. Appearance and reality kept diverging, and he let them. 3 days after the big bud reached his yard, he opened a new ledger book with a black cover and wrote the first line in block letters, Unit BB 400, Rebuild Comparison. Under it, he drew 2 columns. Left column, actual cash outflow. Right column, avoided annual payment from Clint's proposal, $39,481. Every invoice went into that frame. Engine block remanufacture, $18,600. Injection and turbo systems, $9,420. Transmission and clutch assembly work, $6,780. Tires from a bankruptcy lot in Hall County, $3,960. Hydraulic lines and fittings, $2,115. Wiring harness and relays, $1,740. Fabrication and bracket machining, $4,830. Cab glass and paint materials, $1,380. Miscellaneous hardware, seals and fluids, $5,275. Purchase plus freight, $1,200. Total all in by final tightening pass, $54,300. If you are learning something from this, pay attention to what Roy tracked next, because this is where discipline turns into decision power. He did not stop at purchase totals. He logged hours, fuel burn, and acres covered against his existing two-tractor setup and one hired operator schedule. By the second week of May 2004, Roy had enough field data to estimate operating impact with more than coffee shop confidence. On 2,000 combined owned and rented acres, primary tillage with the rebuilt unit and an 80-foot cultivator projected at $12.85 per acre, all in, including fuel, maintenance reserve, and labor allocation. The prior arrangement had run $31.40 per acre when all costs were honestly assigned. Delta, $18.55 per acre. Multiplied by 2,000 acres, one season savings, $37,100. That figure did not include potential custom passes for neighbors if weather windows tightened. He kept living exactly as before while those numbers developed. The farmhouse did not change. The truck did not change. Household spending stayed near plan. Annual target $19,340, with groceries bought in bulk and repairs handled before replacement. Roy's one luxury was time, and he bought it with margin. When parts delayed planting by 2 days, he had no lender clock adding penalties. When diesel bumped higher, he adjusted schedules instead of renegotiating covenants. Debt-free did not mean risk-free. It meant choices remained his. Clint Morrow heard about the rebuild by way of the Highway 34 coffee counter and treated it as proof of stubbornness. At a parts supplier breakfast in Hastings, he called the project Junkyard Theater and told younger operators that scale requires leverage. He had numbers too, and some were valid in stable years. Tax treatment advantages, warranty transfer, predictable service intervals, but his model assumed revenue continuity and manageable rates across long notes. Roy's model assumed disruption as a certainty and designed around survival first. That was the crux neither side could avoid. Late that month, one of the younger farmers from the dealership, Caleb Dunn, drove out to Roy's place after supper and asked to see the ledger. Roy handed him the book, pointed to the columns, and said 6 words: count total cost, then count pressure. Caleb stood by the shop light for 20 minutes, reading line items and penciled dates. He asked what to do if he already had financed equipment. Roy did not scold him. He said, protect cash, sell what idles, end one note. It was practical, not dramatic. Let me stop here and ask you something directly. When two strategies both work in good years, do you judge them by appearance or by what survives the first bad year without taking a family under? By early June, the big bud was in field paint and running steady at load, and Roy entered the final comparison line for the phase he cared about most. Capital outlay complete at $54,300 versus offered finance path total at $789,624. A difference, $735,324. He circled the number once and closed the book. He did not frame it. He did not show it around town. He put it in the same desk drawer where Glenn Ramsey had kept sharpened pencils and tax receipts. Out in the yard, the rusted Ford sat beside the rebuilt machine, mirror still held by fence wire, 2 different forms of value parked 10 feet apart. One looked poor. One looked rough. Both were paid for. Roy left them there until dusk and walked into the shop with the black ledger under one arm and 3 older binders under the other, because he knew the rebuild numbers would only persuade people if the long pattern sat beside them. On his workbench, under a single yellow bulb, he opened records that ran back to his first full season and started a clean comparison sheet titled Capital Avoided, Capital Redirected. He was not building a speech. He was building proof. He wrote the first sequence as a decade chain, then checked each line against deposit slips and tax schedules. 1988. Gross farm revenue, $176,400. No term machinery debt. Year-end retained cash, $21,700. 1989. Decline finance planner package that carried a projected annual note of $21,760, spent $3,100 on repairs instead. Difference preserved $18,660. 1990, retained earnings $27,900, split between operating reserve and certificate deposits. 1991, bought 24 acres from an estate at $1,020 per acre, total $24,480 cash. 1992, drought-reduced yield, corn down to 100Z 17 bushels per acre on his better ground, still cash flow positive by $9,340 because fixed obligations remained low. 1993, machinery repairs $6,820 versus quoted replacement package, requiring $31,200 down and $14,880 annual payments. 1994, storage timing gained $25,960. 1995, truck transmission replacement $1,380 versus replacement pickup financing of $468 per month. Annual debt avoided $5,616. 1996, inherited paid-for acres and $41. 300 cash reserve from Glenn Ramsey's estate. No encumbrances attached. 1997, purchased 160 acres at $1,150 per acre. Total $184,000 cash. By midnight, he had continued into the years people in town actually remembered, the years that made his choices look old-fashioned until they were not. 1998. Gross crop revenue, $412,700. Debt service, $0. Retained cash, $74,900. 1999. Grain bin system purchase, $42,600 cash. Carrying capacity rose enough to delay 174,000 bushels for stronger basis windows. Realized pricing improvement $31,200 compared with average nearby spot bids. 2,000, major repairs $18,440. Avoided replacement debt with estimated annual payment $27,900. 2001, yields down 14%. Still positive operating margin, $22,600. 2002, added 80 acres at $1,420 per acre, $113,600 cash. 2003, net operating margin, $186,300, year-end liquidity, $337,400. First half of 2004, Big Bud rebuild all-in $54,300. Projected tillage cost drop from $31.40 per acre to $12.85 per acre on 2,000 acres. Operating advantage $37,100. The arithmetic that mattered most sat at the bottom of the page where Roy drew one long bracket over 20 years and labeled it avoided machinery notes. Using conservative assumptions, 5 major finance purchases he never made would have required combined annual debt service averaging $96,740 across overlapping periods. He had replaced that burden with average annual repair and rebuild spending of $31,880. Difference, $64,860 per year. Over 20 seasons, without even adding investment return, that gap represented $1,297,200 in preserved cash flow. Roy did add return because he had the statements. Average blended return on reserves parked in insured deposits, short treasuries, and later money market accounts, tracked at 4.1% across full cycles. Compounded carefully, the redirected margin exceeded $1,940,000 before land appreciation. The land, meanwhile, had moved from weighted average purchase prices under $1,300 per acre in his early acquisitions to county averages above $6,000 per acre in stronger years. By the first week of July 2004, he had one more column built that turned private discipline into plain language. Household extraction from the farm over the prior decade averaged $19,340 per year, never above $21,000, including food, utilities, transport, insurance, taxes, clothing, church giving, and basic repairs on the old farmhouse. Comparable households carrying new machinery and larger home payments often required $62,000 to $88,000 annual draws before tuition or medical shocks. Roy did not frame this as moral superiority. He framed it as pressure difference. Lower personal burn rate left him room to wait out weak commodity months without borrowing against next season. He then ran a forward stress test for 2005 with 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, normal weather, corn 192 bushels per acre, soybeans 58, diesel $2.05 per gallon, fertilizer stable. Scenario 2, input squeeze, diesel $2.75, nitrogen up 20%, yield steady. Scenario 3, weather and price hit together, corn 153, soybeans 44, diesel $3.10, fertilizer up 25%, basis weak by 17 cents per bushel. In Scenario 3, operators carrying annual machinery debt above $70,000 and operating lines resetting above 9% moved into negative free cash after rent and family living. Roy stayed positive in all 3 cases, not because his yields would be better, but because his fixed commitments were dramatically lower. This was the entire philosophy in one line of pencil. Survival first, expansion second. Across the county, most families had built around a different framework because for a long time it looked rational. Lenders encouraged leverage during stable stretches, dealers offered seasonal incentives, and tax strategy conversations often prioritized depreciation over durability. Nate Hollis was the clearest example of a good operator caught in that prevailing paradigm. Nate had grown from 1,100 to 1,680 acres with disciplined agronomy and long days, but his capital stack became non-trivial. 2 tractors, 1 combine, and a strip-till bar financed in separate years with different reset dates, plus a variable operating line tied to prime. His machinery obligations reached $52,200 annually, and when rates climbed, his operating interest cost rose by another $31,400 in less than 24 months. Nate was not careless. He was overexposed. Darren Kemp followed a similar path with a different mix. He signed a package totaling $612,000 for late-model equipment, attracted by lower downtime projections and dealer service guarantees. The blended annual debt service landed at $74,900, workable under strong yield and average basis assumptions. Darren also carried land rent increases that stepped each season from $168 to $196 per acre on key tracts, because competition for acres was fierce. He was efficient, respected, and often the first person to help a neighbor pull a truck out of a ditch in winter. His vulnerability was structural. Too many fixed outflows before the first bushel moved. Luis Ortega's numbers were tighter from the beginning. He added 320 acres under a land contract with aggressive principal steps, believing the added scale would stabilize per-unit costs over time. On paper, the projection held if yields stayed near trend and input inflation stayed moderate. In practice, machinery liens and operating debt layered on top of the contract, and any variance in weather translated directly into payment stress. Luis and his wife kept their household spending lean, but household thrift cannot neutralize a distorted capital structure when multiple notes come due in the same quarter. Even younger farmers took signals from the shine in dealership lots, because shine signaled legitimacy in an industry that was becoming more capital-intensive each year. Caleb Dunn, who had read Roy's ledger under the shop light, had one financed tractor and one financed planter with total annual payments of $28,640 and crop insurance obligations that climbed with acreage. He was not in immediate danger, but he stood at a fork where one more finance purchase could remove his margin for error. Roy told him to end one note before adding another. Caleb listened, then sold an underused sprayer, paid down principal, and bought himself time. Clint Morrow kept presenting leverage as the modern necessity, and he was not wrong about one narrow point. Debt can accelerate growth in favorable cycles. The trade-off was what happened when cycles turned and rates moved faster than revenue. Clint's seminar slides showed horsepower, efficiency gains, and tax treatment. Roy's legal pad showed payment calendars, stress scenarios, and downside exposure. Two frameworks, two definitions of risk. 3 days after Labor Day, 2005, the county learned which framework bent first. Diesel jumped harder than most budgets had modeled. Fertilizer invoices arrived 27% higher than the prior year on key blends. Then, late summer moisture failed across enough of Adams County to cut yields well below optimistic projections. Cash bids softened during the same window because regional movement surged as producers sold early to meet obligations. The resulting tension was brutal. Higher costs, lower yields, weaker prices, and fixed payments that did not care. Nate Hollis fought through harvest with dignity and no excuses. He sold grain, liquidated one piece of equipment, and negotiated extensions where he could. It was not enough. Missing a $52,200 annual machinery payment triggered default terms that accelerated other obligations. By winter, his lender required a court-supervised auction on major assets. Neighbors showed up, not to watch a spectacle, but to stand with him while the machinery moved. Nate leased ground the next season and kept farming where he could. He kept his work ethic. He lost ownership. Darren Kemp pursued restructuring before foreclosure, meeting twice with his bank and once with an outside consultant. The offered revision moved key notes to 11.2% and extended maturity, lowering immediate principal, but raising total long-run cost. He accepted because the alternative was immediate liquidation. 2 years later, when another weak cycle hit, the burden proved unsustainable. Darren sold core equipment, shifted to smaller custom hay operations, and started paying down the remaining balance in disciplined steps. The transition was painful, but he stayed in agriculture and protected his family from deeper collapse. Luis Ortega made the hardest concession. To satisfy operating debt and machinery liens while avoiding full foreclosure, he sold 320 acres, the exact tract he had added to secure long-term stability. The sale closed below his hoped value because distressed inventory was rising. He retained a smaller operating footprint and kept working with relentless consistency, but the equity loss took years to rebuild. No one who understood the numbers blamed him. He had made one bet on continuity in a period defined by discontinuity. Roy watched all three outcomes with a restraint that came from memory. He did not lecture. He did not say he had warned anyone. He went back to works because his machinery debt was zero, because his capital outlay on the Big Bud was already behind him, and because his liquidity cushion remained intact. He could pivot when others were forced to retreat. He kept planting his own acres, then opened custom deep rip and tillage slots as neighbors needed help covering windows they could no longer hit with reduced fleets. By harvest close that year, the numbers in his ledger had moved from projection to evidence. Custom tillage volume reached 18,400 acres at $44 per acre gross. Total custom gross, $809,600. After fuel, labor allocation, wear reserve, and transport, net margin held at $15.20 per acre, total $279,680. On his own operation, the rebuilt system delivered verified savings of $43,910 against his prior cost structure, once all inputs and labor were reconciled. Grain sold from disciplined storage timing added $118,400 above spot bids he had declined at harvest lows. Incremental one-season cash impact, $441,990. Set beside Clint's proposed annual note of $39,481, Roy's one difficult season generated enough incremental cash to cover 11.1 years of that payment schedule. Set beside the full 20-year financing total of $789,624, it did not erase the whole figure, but it crushed the assumption beneath it, that large debt was the price of staying viable. On a cold evening in November, Roy copied the finished season totals into the back of the black ledger, closed it, and placed it in the same drawer as his father's pencil books. Outside, the Ford's mirror still held on by fence wire, and the rebuilt Big Bud sat under a yard light with dry mud on the lugs. Both machines quiet, both purchased without asking next year for permission. The next public test came 11 days later, when the Adams County Equipment Expo opened its doors at the fairgrounds, and Clint Morrow took the noon slot for a seminar titled Financing for Competitive Scale. He stood under bright lights with a headset microphone and a slide deck full of clean numbers, and halfway through his presentation, he glanced toward the parking lot, spotted Roy's rusted Ford by the fence, and made his line to the room. He called it false economy on four wheels. Some people laughed because they had heard versions of that joke for years. Then Roy drove through the service gate in the rebuilt Big Bud, parked it just outside the roll-up door, and climbed down with the same black ledger that had sat in his desk drawer beside his father's pencils. He set a plywood board across the hood, taped photocopied invoices in chronological order, and wrote one heading at the top with a thick carpenter marker. Total cash spent, total payment avoided, show your math. He did not ask for a microphone. He simply told the nearest group, "Check any line you want." By mid-afternoon, the crowd around Clint's financing table had thinned, and the crowd around the Big Bud had thickened into 3 rows. Young operators traced Roy's entries with their fingers. Older operators asked for serial numbers and shop contacts. One retired mechanic from Juniata checked torque specs in Roy's notes and said the rebuild looked conservative, not optimistics. Clint walked over, read the totals, and asked whether Roy had included his own labor at market rate. Roy pointed to a line item labeled Labor Allocation, 412 hours at $22, total $9,064, already included in operating cost per acre. The arithmetic held. At 3:20, banker Ellen Price arrived from the Hastings branch with a manila folder because she had heard the noise from two customers who left the bank and drove straight to the expo. She did not grandstand. She stood beside the hood, asked Roy for permission, and read one sentence from a signed verification letter dated that morning. Roy Ramsey, operating and associated liquid farm accounts, total available cash equivalents, $612,000, outstanding machinery principal, $0. That was the moment the room pivoted. Not emotionally, mathematically. People who had treated Roy as a stubborn holdout now had to reconcile patched coveralls and fence wire mirror with $612,000 in liquid reserves and no machinery note attached to next spring. A young couple from Roseland asked Ellen to explain how much annual debt service would be required to produce the same flexibility if it came from credit lines instead of cash. She answered directly. At 8.75%, carrying even $400,000 in machinery, an operating exposure could mean $35,000 to $60,000 annual obligations before any principal acceleration, depending on structure and resets. Roy had chosen to carry weather risk, yield risk, and market risk, but almost none of banker risk. If you want to know where this turns from private victory into public responsibility, stay with these next decisions, because this is where Roy stopped proving a point and started transferring a method. By the second week of December 2005, Roy had converted his ledger pages into a plain packet with 4 worksheets and no branding. Page 1 was total cost comparison. Page 2 was downside stress testing. Page 3 was maintenance intervals versus failure costs. Page 4 was personal burn rate control. He printed 60 copies at a local shop and left them on the counter at 2 parts stores, 1 feed mill, and Ellen's lobby with a note that said free, return if useful. Then he began lending time in the form he trusted most. 0 interest principal agreements with clear dates and collateral that protected both sides. Nate Hollis came first. 3 days before Christmas, hat in both hands, asking if Roy knew of any short lease on workable ground after the court-supervised auction, stripped his machinery line. Roy did not ask him to retell the auction. He already knew enough. Instead, he drove with Nate to a 160-acre parcel south of Air that had sold out of a distressed estate at $2,200 per acre, total $352,000, and was sitting with no active tenant because 2 larger bidders had pulled back from operating risk. Roy bought the tract with a certified check and offered Nate terms that looked old-fashioned because they were built for recovery, not extraction, purchase basis. $352,000 plus $8,960, closing and legal. Total contract principal, $360,960, 0 interest, annual principal step, $22,560 for 16 years, with a crop failure clause allowing 1 deferred installment every 5 years if county yields fell below trigger thresholds. No balloon, no hidden fees. If Nate prepaid, principal dropped dollar for dollar. Nate signed at Roy's kitchen table under the same yellow light that had seen 4 decades of ledgers. 3 days passed before word spread beyond family circles, because neither man announced it. Darren Kemp came next in January 2006 with a different problem. He had shifted to custom hay to stabilize cash flow, but lacked a dependable mower conditioner, and square baler after liquidating equipment under restructuring terms. New replacements quoted through dealership channels would have required $118,400 financed, with blended annual payments near $16,900 over 10 years at rates north of 9%. Roy found a used pair at two auctions, paid $42,300 and $19,800, then spent $6,400 on bearings, knotter rebuilds, and hydraulic work. Total basis, $68,500. He sold the package to Darren at exact cost with a written zero-interest note over 7 years, $9,785 principal per year, first payment deferred until after first cutting receipts. Darren cried once quietly when he read the no-interest line twice to make sure he had not missed a decimal. Roy told him to keep his maintenance log cleaner than his checkbook and left before supper. Luis Ortega met Roy and Ellen in February at the bank conference room because his challenge was operational liquidity after selling 320 acres to satisfy liens. He had retained enough ground to remain viable, but seed, fertilizer, and fuel invoices were front-loaded, and his remaining line terms carried penalty pricing if he missed spring milestones. Roy and Ellen built a bridge structure with 3 protections: a $48,000 zero-interest input loan from Roy dispersed directly to suppliers, a mandatory cash flow worksheet updated monthly, and a covenant that no new machinery note could be added until 2 seasons of positive free cash. Luis objected to taking help unless he could pledge something real. Roy accepted a second position lien on a paid-off grain trailer and a personal guarantee capped at principal only. No interest accrual, no late fee ladder. The intent was to keep Luis operating without giving a bad year the power to cascade into another liquidation. By March 2006, one more family entered the circle, this time from a younger generation. Caleb Dunn had taken Roy's advice and sold an underused sprayer, but he still carried 2 notes that squeezed his spring window. Roy did not refinance him. He offered a narrower intervention: $26,400 for seed and chemical prepay at cash discount, 0 interest for 11 months, repaid from post-harvest settlements. The discount Caleb captured by paying suppliers early was $3,180, effectively reducing his input cost while avoiding additional bank exposure. Roy made Caleb show the invoices and the discount lines in writing before releasing funds. None of these deals were handshakes alone. Each one was documented, recorded where appropriate, and built to teach as much as to rescue. Roy's rule remained the same: clear principle, clear dates, clear consequences, no compounding interest against a family that was already underwater. If you are learning something from this, pay attention to the design principle under every contract. He did not erase responsibility. He removed the time pressure that converts one bad season into permanent loss. The deeper proof emerged when Ellen Price and Roy held 2 evening sessions at the County Extension Hall, not as a motivational event, but as a worksheet clinic. They projected anonymous scenarios first, then named cases only with permission. Their framework decomposed farm pressure into 4 numbers every operator could calculate in 1 hour. Number 1 was fixed annual obligations. Number 2 was variable cost per acre. Number 3 was household extraction. Number 4 was stress-adjusted revenue at conservative yield and price assumptions. For a typical leverage profile in the room, fixed obligations ran $96,000 to $182,000 annually when machinery, land contracts, and operating interest were combined. Variable costs range from $314 to $402 per acre, depending on input strategy. Household extraction averaged $58,000. Under a mild stress case, free cash turned negative by $40,000 to $120,000, forcing either asset sales or debt rollover. Roy's profile was not magic. It was structural. Fixed obligations, excluding rent on leased acres, were near zero on machinery. Variable cost per acre remained competitive because repairs and fuel were managed tightly. Household extraction stayed near $19,340. Under the same mild stress case, he remained positive, and under severe stress, he bent but did not break. Then they ran the Big Bud comparison, in full sequence for anyone who still thought the rebuild was a one-off lucky strike. 2004 capital outlay, $54,300 cash. Financed alternative offered, total $789,624 over 20 years at 8.75%. Annual payment avoided, $39,481. 2005 verified operating delta on Roy's acreage, $43,910. 2005 custom tillage net, $279,680. 2005 storage timing gain, $118,400. Combined incremental cash that season, $441,990. From that total, Roy allocated portions with specific destinations. Reserve reinforcement, $220,000. Tax liability set aside, $96,000. Land opportunity fund, $80,000. Direct recovery contracts initiated for neighbors, $45,990 in immediate short-term commitments by year-end, excluding Nate Hollis's separately documented December land contract principal of $360,960, then expanded in early 2006 as cash settled. Ellen added one final line that landed harder than any speech. If Roy had taken Clint's 20-year machinery note, that obligation would have survived every drought, every diesel spike, every basis collapse. The bank would have required payment whether Fields cooperated or not. By avoiding that note and accepting controlled repair risk, Roy converted a fixed liability into discretionary deployment. That discretionary deployment became Nate's acreage path, Darren's equipment reset, Luis's input bridge, and Caleb's discount capture. By late April 2006, the first outcomes were measurable. Nate planted all 160 acres under his zero-interest contract and hit his first principal target on schedule after harvest advances. Darren completed his first custom hay season with positive net cash and no new machinery debt. Luis met every supplier payment date under the bridge plan and carried no penalties into summer. Caleb cleared his short note from crop proceeds and did not add a third long-term equipment payment. Roy still drove the same truck home each night, mirror tied with fence wire, coveralls patched at one knee, and ate supper in the same two-bedroom farmhouse purchased in 1969 for $18,500. But now the county had seen the ledger, the bank letter, and the contracts. The appearance remained modest. The reality had become public. Wealth was not the new paint. It was the freedom to keep other families in the game when the numbers turned against them. By late April 2006, with early recovery outcomes for Nate Hollis, Darren Kemp, Luis Ortega, and Caleb Dunn already posting positive in Roy Ramsey's and Ellen Price's worksheet files, the county's next pressure point was being read less as rumor and more as arithmetic. The loudest entry sat in Roy's own records as a January note, copied from a county auction docket pinned on feed store corkboards from Hastings to Juniata. 1,120 acres from a distressed estate, liquidated in 4 tracts and 1 combined bid. That January entry stayed in the binder as a brief factual line, not a legend. Clint Morrow arrived early in a new dealership pickup and repeated to anyone listening that cash buyers were mostly folklore at that scale, that real operators needed structured leverage, and that sentiment did not close land deals. Roy parked the same 1978 Ford by the gravel edge, mirror still tied with fence wire, and registered with a folded envelope in his coat. The rest of the line was purely mechanical. 2 regional groups pushed bidding through the first rounds. At $1,780 per acre, several local farmers dropped out. At $1,800, the auctioneer requested financing confirmation from the final bidders because closing terms were short. Roy handed the clerk a bank-certified check and registered for the combined total. Final hammer price, $2,016,000. No contingency, no delayed approval. Cash verified on site. The significance was not the purchase itself, but the structure that followed. Roy filed the parcel, split exactly as modeled. 640 acres moved into a conservation and cash flow trust, with rotational lease income directed to reserve stability, and 480 acres designated for lease-to-own contracts aimed at operators damaged by debt rollover. Terms held to the same tested framework: 0 interest, fixed principal, transparent annual steps, written crop failure deferral clauses, no compounding penalties. He called it structure without suffocation. By March 2006, that 480-acre section already had 3 agreements in place. Nate added 120 acres, contiguous, to his recovery tract with principals set at $264,000 over 12 years, $22,000 annual, 0 interest. Darren took 80 acres suited to forage rotation, $168,000 over 14 years, $12,000 annual. Luis leased 140 acres with purchase option steps tied to positive free cash targets and no prepayment penalties. The remaining 140 acres were held for younger entrants who completed Ellen Price's full-cost worksheet program before signing. The county watched those contracts the way people watch spring skies, cautiously, because everyone had seen rescue plans fail when assumptions were soft. Roy's assumptions were hard. He required monthly cash flow updates, maintenance logs on financed equipment, and proof that no new high-interest machinery note had been added. He was not trying to control lives. He was protecting the same principle that had protected him. Keep fixed obligations low enough that weather cannot take title to your future. 3 crop seasons later, the outcome stopped looking provisional. Nate met every principal step on the first 160-acre agreement, made 10 of 12 payments on time on the added 120, and used 1 weather-triggered deferral exactly as designed during a dry year. Darren's hay operation stabilized, then expanded through custom contracts instead of debt-financed iron. By 2014, he had replaced his oldest baller with a cash purchase from retained earnings. Luis rebuilt working capital gradually, and by 2016, his daughter Elena had come home full-time to the farm office and field planning, bringing better cost tracking and marketing discipline than most operations twice their size. Caleb Dunn's trajectory was quieter, but just as instructive. He used Roy's short, zero-interest input bridge once, then never requested another. Instead, he adopted the 4-page worksheet method, sold another underused implement, and paid off his planter note 3 years ahead of schedule. In 2013, he bought 60 acres at $4,100 per acre, with 40% down and a short fixed note he cleared in 6 years. By 2020, he carried no machinery debt at all. He later told a local extension class that the most profitable line he ever learned was Roy's 6-word instruction by the shop light: count total cost, then count pressure. As these families regained footing, Roy and Ellen formalized what had begun as private contracts. In 2012, they established the Ramsey Field Margin Fund with an initial $3,200,000 seed endowment, built from accumulated land lease surplus and grain margin allocations. The fund issued 12 no-interest loans for equipment and seed, each capped at $85,000, each requiring a written plan showing fixed obligations under stress scenarios. Defaults stayed at 0. 2 borrowers used weather deferrals, both cured within 1 season. By 2024, those 12 recipients collectively controlled 3,960 acres, valued at $21,384,000, with combined machinery debt ratios less than half county averages. That was the multiplier Roy had wanted from the start. Not charity that expires, but structure that compounds. Clint Morrow's resolution came in plain view, without drama. Through 2007 and 2008, as more variable rate stress hit leveraged operators, his dealership lot began filling with repossessed units that had barely reached midlife hours. Commission checks shrank, then turned erratic. The same urgency language he had once used to close 20-year notes became harder to sustain when customers were selling grain early just to meet annual payments. At a 2008 county panel on farm financing, he was asked directly whether long-term machinery debt had protected his clients through volatility. He paused, looked at a room that now included operators he had known for 20 years, and said, "Not the way we sold it." He sold the franchise in 2008, remained financially stable from prior earnings, and reopened as a used equipment broker with mandatory total cost disclosures on every sheet: purchase price, expected repair range, projected 5-year carrying cost, downside notes if yields fell below trend. He stopped mocking old machinery and started asking buyers about cash reserves first. It was not a conversion speech. It was a professional correction made late but made clearly. He retired in 2021. His final recorded interview with a regional paper included the line people still quote, because it settled the argument better than any seminar slide. "I sold payments for 20 years, Roy sold time, and time won." By the second week of October 2024, the full roll call could be read without loose ends. Roy Ramsey still lived in the same 2-bedroom farmhouse his parents bought for $18,500 in 1969. The patched linoleum near the sink had been replaced once, quietly, and the west porch had finally been leveled after a church volunteer weekend, but the place remained modest by any visible measure. The 1978 Ford F-25 still started, now showing 400 to 1,000 miles, with the same fence wire mirror, repaired more neatly but never replaced. Roy still wore patched coveralls in field season. His audited net worth stood at $14,870,000, composed of paid-for land, storage assets, and cash reserves with no machinery, principal outstanding. The rebuilt Big Bud remained operational with 9,200 post-rebuild hours. Average annual maintenance over that life cycle tracked at $8,740, logged to the dollar in the same black ledger style he had used in 2004. No one called it junkyard theater anymore. Nate Hollis had repurchased 160 acres through Roy's zero-interest path and retained lease control on adjacent acres while rebuilding equity the slow way. He never recovered the exact footprint he had before default, but he recovered ownership, which was the point. Darren Kemp cleared all machinery debt in 2021, focused on custom hay and forage contracts, and now runs a lean operation with positive free cash even in weak price years. Luis Ortega transitioned management to Elena Ortega, who operates 240 acres, purchased below market through Roy's trust terms, and teaches spreadsheet budgeting at winter producer meetings. Caleb Dunn now mentors two younger operators on input prepay strategy and stress testing before expansion. Ellen Price remained at the center of the institutional shift. She became chair of a county program that requires full-cost debt math workshops before certain agricultural loan applications are finalized. Her office tracks pre-loan stress case completion, and delinquency rates among participants have remained materially lower than peer groups. She credits producers for doing the hard part, but everyone in the county knows the template began with one farmer's ledger on a tractor hood. Wade Tilson, the scrapyard foreman who sold the Big Bud for $900 plus $300 hauling, kept a photocopy of that bill of sale on his office wall until he retired. Harold Jensen, whose loss in 1985 helped shape Roy's framework, passed away years earlier. His son now leases ground locally and has said publicly that Roy's no-interest contract model gave him back a sense that farming could be stable again. Glenn and Irene Ramsey remained where they had always been in Roy's private accounting, not as names in a speech, but as the origin of the rule that outlived both of them. The physical evidence that carried this story never disappeared into legend. Roy's original black ledger, the Expo invoice board copies, the bank verification letter Ellen read aloud, and the first 4 worksheet templates were archived in the Adams County Agricultural Extension Records Room in 2022, scanned and indexed for producer classes. What began as one man's private comparison became public curriculum. The final arithmetic stayed almost embarrassingly simple. One path required $39,481 every year for 20 years on a single machinery note, regardless of drought, diesel, or basis collapse. The other path required $54,300 cash, relentless maintenance, and disciplined record-keeping, then produced operating flexibility that kept one farm independent and helped multiple families stay on land. Appearance suggested poverty. Arithmetic revealed capacity. At dusk, on an ordinary November evening, Roy parked the Ford beside the Big Bud, shut the shop lights, and carried the day's receipts to the same desk drawer where his father once kept sharpened pencils. The truck looked worn. The tractor looked old. Both were paid for, and around them, acres that could have been lost were still being farmed by people who had been given time instead of terms. The next morning, Roy set the previous day's receipts on the kitchen table beside Glenn Ramsey's oldest pencil ledger, and the phone rang before the percolator finished. Ellen Price asked if he could be in Hastings by 6 that evening. Nate had called her at dawn from the cab of his grain truck and said he wanted to make his final principal transfer in person, not through wire instructions, because one line in one contract had kept his family farming. Roy said he would come, folded the bank deposit slip into his shirt pocket, and drove the Ford into town with the fence wire mirror vibrating at every bridge seam. At 6:12, the conference room at Ellen's branch held more mud on the floor than carpet showed through. Nate Hollis stood at the end of the table with a cashier check for $22,560, the exact annual step from the later adjacent acreage contract tranche, paid early because 2 storage sales had cleared above his stress case assumptions. Ellen opened the contract binder, confirmed that the first 160-acre agreement had already been completed and stamped paid in full in 2024 after its single weather deferral, then turned the page toward Roy for the remaining adjacent principal release. He read the line twice, nodded once, and signed. Ellen stamped paid in full over the adjacent acreage rider. Nate did not make a speech. He pressed his palm flat on the paper for a second and said, "My son gets to start from owned ground." Roy told him, "Keep your obligations lighter than your optimism," and slid the stamped copy across the table. The room stayed quiet because everyone understood that sentence had been earned. 3 nights later, Darren Kemp rolled into Roy's yard with a binder held together by baler twine and a yellow tab marking his final machinery note, payoff from 2021, now followed by 3 clean years of retained earnings. He spread his numbers on Roy's workbench under the same yellow bulb Caleb had once read by. Gross custom hay receipts for 2024, $286,400. Fuel, labor, twine, repairs, insurance, $201,730. Net, $84,670. Debt service on machinery, $0. Darren asked if he should replace his oldest rake with a financed package offered at 7.9%. Roy pointed at Darren's maintenance column and then at his reserve line. "Run 1 more season. Buy in cash if you still need it." Darren laughed once, not from mockery but relief, and wrote the decision in his own notebook before he left. By the 3rd week of November, Luis Ortega and Elena Ortega met Roy and Ellen at the county clerk office for the trust transfer on Elena's 240-acre tract. The market in neighboring sales had moved near $9,400 per acre, but the trust formula priced her purchase at $6,850, with 0 interest over 15 years, annual principal $109,600 divided into 2 payments aligned to post-harvest liquidity windows. Elena arrived with a full stress worksheet, already updated for diesel at $3.85 and corn at a conservative cash projection. Ellen reviewed it line by line, then asked one final question. She asked every recipient now. "What happens if you miss your best weather window?" Elena answered without looking down. "I delay expansion, protect working cash, and do not add fixed machinery debt." She signed. Luis looked at Roy and tried to say more than thank you, then stopped midway and shook his hand instead. That unfinished sentence never returned, and nobody in the room needed it to. Caleb Dunn's payoff came in a classroom rather than an office. On a cold December night at the extension hall, he taught 14 younger operators through the 4-page method Roy had handed him years earlier. He wrote his own old numbers on the board first so nobody could accuse him of hindsight. Planter note, annual payment $11,240. Tractor note, annual payment $17,400. Input bridge from Roy, $26,400. Repaid after harvest with $3,180 supplier discount captured. Then he showed his current profile. No machinery debt, fixed obligations under $24,000 including land taxes and leases, and a reserve target equal to 14 months of household and operating essentials. When one attendee asked if that was too conservative for growth, Caleb repeated the 6 words that had redirected his life. Count total cost, then count pressure. On January 9, 2025, the Ramsey Field Margin Fund held its annual recipient review, and this was where the multiplier became visible in one room. 12 borrowers sat at 2 long tables with updated acreage maps, yield sheets, and payment records. Ellen read the portfolio arithmetic aloud. Original seed endowment, $3,200,000. 12 no-interest loans issued, each capped at $85,000. Total disbursed to date $948,000 across equipment, seed, and working inputs. Repayment rate 100% on schedule, adjusted for 2 weather-triggered deferrals. Default 0. Current controlled acreage by recipients 3,960. Estimated combined land value $21,384,000 using verified county comps. Roy sat at the back in patched coveralls and said almost nothing until the youngest borrower asked what condition he cared about most. He answered in 8 words. No hidden fees, no hidden pressure, no panic. That same week closed the final physical thread that had followed the story since Grand Island. Wade Tilson's daughter arrived at the extension office with a flat envelope from her father's desk after his retirement. Inside was the original scrapyard bill of sale carbon for the Big Bud, $900 unit price, and $300 hauling written in faded blue ink, plus a note from Wade stating he wanted it placed with the archived ledger materials so students can see where this started. The archivist logged it beside Roy's black ledger, the Expo invoice board copies, Ellen's verification letter, and the first worksheet templates. Every item that had carried proof now had a shelf number, a scan file, and a sign-out record for winter classes. Clint Morrow's final resolution arrived without theater at a February cooperative breakfast in Hastings. He came in from retirement for one panel on total cost disclosure, wearing a plain work coat instead of dealership branding, and sat 2 chairs down from Roy. The moderator asked the question that had hung over 2 decades of arguments. What had he learned after selling financed equipment through volatile cycles? Clint did not dodge it. He said the model he promoted treated debt as a neutral tool and ignored timing risk, rate risk, and household extraction risk in too many families. He described the repossession years by their arithmetic, not their shame. Machines with low hours returning to lots, while owners lost equity and sleep. He said his later brokerage rule required every buyer to see 5-year carrying cost under a bad year scenario before signing. Then he looked at Roy and repeated the line now recorded in county training packets. I sold payments for 20 years. Roy sold time, and time won. He retired financially secure with no bitterness in his voice and no appetite left for leveraged sermons. By March 2025, the roll call could be read in present tense. Roy still farmed from the same modest house, porch now level, kitchen patch replaced, budget still restrained. The Ford sat at 404,118 miles, mirror still reinforced by wire under a proper bracket, because Roy never removed a working fix. The Big Bud crossed 9,400 post-rebuild hours, with annual maintenance still averaging near $8,740. Nate owned his 160 and kept building principal on adjacent acres. Darren operated debt-free custom hay and mentored 2 beginners on equipment triage. Luis worked alongside Elena, who ran planning and marketing on the 240-acre tract purchased through the trust. Caleb taught debt stress math each winter and reviewed worksheets for neighbors before they signed notes. Ellen chaired the county pre-loan workshop program and documented lower delinquency among participants. Wade was retired in Grand Island, fishing more and still amused that a scrap ticket had become course material. Harold Jensen had long since passed, and his son remained in local production with a balance sheet built to bend, not snap. Glenn and Irene Ramsey remained where Roy still visited each planning week. 2 stones, 1 rule carried forward. At dusk that evening, Roy closed the shop, set the day's maintenance entries in the black ledger, and slid the drawer shut with the same careful motion he had used for 20 years. Outside, the old Ford and the rebuilt Big Bud stood in parallel, under 1 yard light, weathered, serviceable, and fully paid, while fields once headed for liquidation remained in the hands of families who had been given room to breathe.